So in the spirit of gaming, we're going to do a role play. So imagine that you are a happily married person living with your spouse. You take care of your aging father after work. Your spouse gets a lucrative job offer on the other side of the country. What should you do? So should you A, stay and try to have a long distance relationship? B, move with your spouse? Or C, this is too stressful, I'm going backpacking across Europe like I should have after I graduated college? For those of you playing at home, the answer is C. Congratulations, you won. You get all the points. So if you're a thinking human, you might have some questions about this, such as, but I love my spouse? Who is going to take care of my dad? Can I even afford this trip to Europe? And you know what? You are absolutely right. The situation is a lot more complicated than that. This is what is known as a complex problem. So let's talk a little bit about simple versus complex problems. So simple problems have one single solution. So simple problems fill in that multiple choice format very nicely because there's one single solution, there's one right answer, nothing else can work. So you pick A, B, or C, and it can only be one of those. But complex problems have multiple solution paths. So maybe choice A gets you this, but not that, but choice B gets you certain advantages and other disadvantages. So, but they're both right. Like they both eventually get you what you want. So that's why having that question in a multiple choice format was so ridiculous, because obviously there are multiple solutions and not one single one. Simple problems also have one best solution. So there's one way to do this. There is one answer that covers everything, and we don't need to think about anything else. But complex problems have more or less optimal solutions. So like I was saying before, you have trade-offs. So if I go with solution path A, I get this, but maybe not that. But if I go with solution path B, I get other things, but I lose out on something else. Finally, simple problems present the information necessary to solve. So you have all the information presented to you, you understand what the variables are, and if you don't have all the information, you know how to get the information. This is different from complex problems. Complex problems either have missing information or you don't know how to get the information that is missing. So you don't even know what you don't know. And that makes a problem a lot more complex. So in the spirit of games, I would draw an analogy for simple and complex problems. So tic-tac-toe is considered a simple problem. So it has a really well-defined space. You have your 3x3 grid. You have all your X's and O's, and it's a relatively easy problem to solve. So you either play defensively or you try to play offensively. And the reason we typically don't play tic-tac-toe beyond the age of 5 is because it's a very simple problem to solve, and it's not really that interesting for us. So this is a lot different from Go. So Go is a very complex game. So the objective in Go is to try to capture as much territory as possible. And there are almost infinite ways of doing it. There is no algorithmic solution for solving a problem in Go. That's why it was such a big deal when recently Google's AI finally beat a human player, because you can't simply do easy decision trees in order to solve the problem. It's a very complicated problem. So Go is to complex problems as tic-tac-toe is to simple problems. So I'm interested in what you guys have to say about this. So I would like you to take a minute or two and in chat, share with me and with the other attendees, what are some simple and complex problems in your work environment? And I'm going to post the definitions again so that you can remember them and see how it applies to what you're doing. Okay, so I'm not seeing any contributions on my screen. I'm sorry if you did, because I would love to go over the examples with you from your workplaces. So in that case, I'll just provide you with examples from my workplace. So it's fairly easy for me to resize an image in Photoshop. So I have this image, need to make it smaller. There's an algorithmic solution to that. So I go through the motions, I go through all the steps, and I can resize the problem. A complex problem is like what I'm going to be discussing with you today about multiple. So I work with a SME, I get information, but then I have to develop this narrative for them. And that's a complicated problem. There's no single solution for that. I could try multiple different things that will have pros and cons that will meet the SME's expectations. So those are some simple and complex problems in my work environment. And today we're going to be focusing on those sorts of complex problems. So it's easy to teach people how to solve simple problems. They just need to know the solution algorithm. How do I resize an image? You click this, and you click this. That's a relatively easy solution path. But how do you teach people how to solve complex problems? That's the question I'm a lot more interested in. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. So unfortunately, still today, we have this really outdated model of the way education works. So it goes something like this. So I have this knowledge in my brain, and you don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk at you, or I'm going to give you text, and I'm going to transmit this information from my brain into your brain. Well, we know that doesn't really work because people have their own experiences, values, and culture. So they come to the learning session and they have certain expectations about the way the world works, about their own experiences. And when we act like we can simply just transmit data to their heads, we're not really respecting them as learners. Learners' heads are not empty. They have a lot of knowledge and a lot of really important information. Okay, so we're like, okay, we're going to cut the person out. We have this technology now. So we replaced the human with a computer. And as it turns out, simply replacing a human with a computer using the same model of education does not work. So this is kind of what education online looks like today. So you create a SCORM, put some text on a screen, be polite to customers, don't be rude. If you're rude to customers, you could lose sales for the company. True or false, you should be rude to customers. As it turns out, this is a very boring way of educating people. So as educational designers, we're like, okay, fine. Look, you get points for answering the question correctly, plus 10 points. Now you have 100 points. Isn't that awesome? She doesn't seem to think so. So why do we do this? Why do we want to just add points? So educational designers are really invested in having our learners complete the course. And so we use these carrots and we dangle them in front of our learners in a way that's like, please, just please finish the course. You can get through it. I know you can do it. Well, this is a very extrinsic way of motivating learners. So it's extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is motivation that comes from the outside of someone. So ways of motivating people, the way that we typically do in e-learning, tend to be through points and leaderboards and trophies. But there's some problems with this approach. So we're going to go to game design theory to explain this. So the MDA framework, which is really well known in game design, is mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. So the mechanics of the game are how I physically interact with the program. So let's take Mario, for example. So I press a button and Mario jumps. So the jumping mechanic exists. Now the dynamics are how the system as a whole interacts in order to create the gaming experience. So the dynamics of the game are Mario jumps, enemies come at him, you jump on the enemies, you move forward, you jump up and down platforms. Those are the dynamics of the game. And then finally, there are the aesthetics. So the aesthetics are the way the game makes me feel. So for those of you who've played old Sonic games like Sonic 2, or if you haven't, Sonic is pretty much like Mario, but much faster. So it's still that platforming game where you jump on things, but the point is to complete the level as quickly as possible. So the aesthetics of that game are really fast, and they get you really pumped, and that's the feeling of fun that the game creates. So when we incorporate things like leaderboards and points into our learning, we're solely focusing on incorporating game mechanics into our educational curriculum, but we're not including the system or the fun. And that's how we get bored learners throughout their training. Okay, so adding points and leaderboards and all that doesn't work. So how am I supposed to motivate my learners? I really need them to finish this course. Well, what if I told you we can intrinsically motivate learners? So while I was reading about this intrinsic and extrinsic motivations literature, I came across this quote, and I think it describes my philosophy on the topic quite well. So from birth onward, humans in their healthiest states are active, inquisitive, curious, and playful creatures, displaying a ubiquitous readiness to learn and explore, and they do not require extraneous incentives to do so. Humans are, again, inherently curious. We are pattern identifying machines. We love to learn. We love seeing patterns in data. and making connections, we are built to learn. That is essential to the survival of our species. So we don't have to do these things like giving people points in order to motivate them to learn, because we're already primed to learn. We just have to tap into that to create really interesting, engaging curricula. So there's this notion of intrinsic motivation. So when I talked about extrinsic motivation, I showed you that dangling the carrot in front of the learner. Well, this is the opposite. So intrinsic motivation comes from the inside. So the learner is motivated to complete the curricula because they want to. So in order to get people to experience this kind of motivation, people need to feel autonomous and competent. So people need to feel in control of their learning experience. If information is just flying at me, I have no control over what someone is saying, I can't interact with them, I'm not going to be intrinsically motivated to complete the course. Also, if I don't feel competent, if you put me in something really hard, I have no idea what I'm doing, then I'm not going to be motivated to complete the course. I'm just going to give up or have to rely on extrinsic motivation. So if you want to intrinsically motivate your learners, the learning activities need to be novel. You can't do the same thing you've been doing over and over. That's not interesting. People will only do that if they have an extrinsic motivator. They need to be aesthetically pleasing. So kind of what we talked about before in the MDA framework, I need to be having fun. I need to think this is somehow appealing to me. And we need to be challenged. So like I said before with tic-tac-toe, the reason we're not all playing tic-tac-toe on our phones is because it's not that challenging. It's a really simple problem and a very easy solution, and we're not challenged at all. We don't fail at it. This sounds an awful lot like video games. You are correct. Games are very good at doing this. Let's talk about it. Okay, so there is this crazy Japanese video game, which is my favorite genre of video games, called Hatoful Boyfriend. And it's a pigeon dating simulation. I don't know if you guys have ever dated pigeons, but I haven't. So I really enjoy having the experience of playing a pigeon dating simulation and doing something I've never done before. So I definitely think that this game counts as being novel. So this game, this is the pause menu for a game I'm playing right now. It's called Persona 5. It's fantastic. It's like my favorite game ever. And this is just what it looks like when you hit the start button. Like, it looks fantastic. And the entire game has this sort of aesthetic. So I'm going to say that this counts as being aesthetically pleasing. So there's this game in the gaming community called Dark Souls 3. And it is notoriously difficult to play. That's kind of the appeal of the game. So someone made these images as a joke to show, like, what's the experience playing Dark Souls? So here's the start of the game, and you go down to tutorial, and it just tells you that you died, because that's pretty much the experience of the entire game. You will die over and over and over again. So I think that counts as being challenging. So Jenny, are you telling me that players like it when they lose? Well, based on all these game over screens, I would venture to say yes. Well, that's very odd. Why do people like to lose? That's a very good question, because it is very unintuitive. So in educational psychology, there's this concept called flow. And so flow is the experience of being so into the activity that you're doing that time just fades away. So if you ever caught yourself reading a really good book, playing a really good game, knitting something interesting and hard, and then you look outside and it's dark, like that's the experience of flow. But flow doesn't occur all the time, obviously. So it's this balance between your skill and the challenge of the task. So if I am really good at something and the task is really easy, I'm not going to experience that state of flow. I'll probably just be annoyed to try to get it quickly out of my way. But if I don't have much skill at something and I have to do something extremely challenging, then I'm not going to enter that flow state. Instead, I'm going to be really anxious. Be like, well, I can't do this. Like, I don't know. So this is a very important concept in games. So games do a pretty good job of optimizing flow. So it scaffolds the learning such that at the beginning of the level, you learn your new skill and use that skill throughout the level. And then by the time you get to the end and you have to beat the boss, you can use those skills you learned to beat the boss. So the skill increases as you practice, and so does the difficulty. So in video game literature on the importance of failure, we see failure as this sort of hypothesis testing. So I'm playing Mario, and I need to get to that third platform. So I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't look like it's that far away. So I'm just gonna go for it. Let's see what happens. So I jump and I missed. Okay, so clearly that is not a good solution path. So let's try again. So I'm back at the platform and I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna revise my hypothesis about the way the world works based on the data I just got about how the world works. So I'm like, okay, so I'm gonna jump to this platform and then I'm going to jump to that platform one step at a time. So let's see how I do. So I jump, get to the first platform, jump, get to the second platform. Another way of framing this sort of hypothesis testing is problem solving. So looking at all my different solution paths and testing them in the world and seeing how they work will inevitably lead to failure. But that failure isn't useless. Failure is typically derided in education because we associate it with things like, I did poorly on this test, which means I'm going to do poorly in the class, which means I won't be able to get into college, which means I won't have a good life. But in this context, failure is good because I'm failing and I get more information about the world. I use that to revise my hypothesis, and then I use that to find a problem path that will work. So just like game designers, instructional designers can create educational spaces for learners in virtual environments that let them explore what if. So what if I do this? What will happen? So I'm going to give you guys some time to play some games because it's always weird when you just like talk about games but you like don't experience them. So I provide the URL here. We're also going to provide it in chat. So let's take 5 minutes and let's go to this URL. Let's play some games and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about them. So we just sent the link in the chat. Okay, it's been a few minutes. So if you have any trouble accessing the game, please let us know in chat. Otherwise, if you want to experience all the games, now might be a good time to switch. Otherwise, just keep playing away. Okay, we're going to give you about 1 more minute to wrap up playing those games, and then we're going to discuss them. And if you have any thoughts or impressions throughout, please feel free to include those in chat. I'd love to hear what you have to say. All right, so if you don't mind, let's wrap up our games. Obviously, you're welcome to play them after the webinar as well. So let's talk about what you guys experienced. So the first game we had on the list is Coring Disaster, and this is WCW's oldest scenario-based game, as far as I'm aware. And I really like the art style of this. WCW hired an artist to kind of capture the style of it. And this is a game by the Court Reporters Association about ethics in court reporting. And if you happen to play it, it's actually quite complicated and not really intuitive. And that's kind of the point about complex problems, is that your intuitions can't really solve it because you have a lot of variables to account for. So in this situation, you're asked to please go off the record. But according to the ethical guidelines of the CRA, you can't do that unless everyone agrees to go off the record. And so in this case, I failed because I had no idea. I was like, someone asked me to go off the record, I'm going to go off the record. But apparently that does not adhere to the Code of Professional Ethics. So I learned that information by experiencing this failure, and I was able to go back and replay with that information to get a better solution. And so this game is particularly helpful because when you fail, it doesn't just let you fail. It's not like just a game over screen. Like, it explains to you the reasoning behind the decision making in the game. And so with this information, I was able to go back and I got a 20 out of 20. So again, I failed, I revised my hypothesis, and now I know. And so having that experience of not abiding by the ethical guidelines was like really shook me. I'm like, I was unethical? I was unethical. So that is a lot more emotional and connecting of an experience for me than just reading that all people must agree to be off the record. So those are the kind of feelings and experiences we want people to have. We want them to feel and we want them to remember, because people generally don't remember text on a screen, but they remember the feeling of like, oh, I just committed a very unethical behavior. So the virtual patient demo was the second scenario that we provided to you, and this is one that I personally worked on. And I'm very pleased with the way it turned out. So we have a lot of clients in the CME community, and so we wanted to make a scenario that could show them the relevance of this work to them. And so in this scenario, you're an internist and you have to make a diagnosis, and you can make the wrong diagnosis, and that has consequences. And so when I created this, I really wanted to emphasize to people that this is not a test. Like, you need to explore your different options. You can play through it as many times as you'd like, go through and just see what happens. And what's really interesting about branching scenarios is that we see a lot of people replaying them. And that indicates to me that there's a lot of engagement. Like, people want to know, like, what would happen if I clicked the other option? And that's kind of the engagement that we don't really see with those kind of PowerPoint based, like, text on a screen, click true or false. And so here you examine an x-ray. I give you a screen where you can see the x-ray just by itself and nothing covering it. But now you're making the diagnosis and you have several options, or you can go back and look at it again. In other words, you are problem solving, just like you did when you were jumping around as Mario, but this time you're Dr. Mario. So the final scenario that we presented to you was one I created for passport acceptance training. So for this scenario, our learners were passport acceptance agents. So you go in, you're trying to get your passport, you have all this documentation, and the person behind the counter has to figure out and help you and make sure you have all the right documentation in order to get your passport. So those are the people who we were training, and this is directed at them. So in this case, so I gave them multiple problems in the scenario because they're going to have multiple clients in a day. And this is one particular problem that they may come across. So I talked to the SMEs, I asked them what some common problems are, and I tried to include that in the scenario. And just in real life, customers get frustrated with you. They're like, why aren't you accepting it? So this is what you get if you pick one of the suboptimal solutions. So if you played through the scenario, like, you'll see, like, the game doesn't end if you just pick the wrong thing. Because if you design it that way, you're just making like a glorified multiple choice exam. So instead, because of complex problems, they have optimal and suboptimal solutions. It's really important in the design to have some suboptimal solution paths. So in this one, we ticked off the customer, but we have a chance to make up for it. So like, oh, the we have a name missing from the birth certificate. And so you talk to the client and she explains why that is, and you have a resolution to the problem. And then I give you a chance to still fail, and then you get a bad ending, or to do the right thing, which is accept it as evidence of citizenship. So if you play through these scenarios and you look through this analysis and you're like, this is pretty cool, you may want one yourself. So if that is the case, we are going to go to branch track. I am going to demo the software for you, and I'll explain some of the basic design principles I use. So just give us a second here as we switch programs. Okay, so I'm going to create a new simulation. I'll start from scratch, and then I'll show you what a completed one looks like. Just as a heads up, BranchTrack recently, really recently updated their software. So what I'm going to show you from the pre-made stuff, like the player looks different than the new stuff. So just keep that in mind if you're following along at home, because you'll see here like old player. Okay, so you start out with a single node, and this is scene one. Like, okay. So my character is going to say, hello, webinar attendees. All right, so let's pick a character to say it. So you can upload your custom images here, and you see like the X-rays here. I like this character. She's really emotive, so I'm going to go with her. And I think it's pretty normal just to say hi to people. And so for the background, you can also upload custom backgrounds. So I'm going to pick, this looks like a generic workspace. Let's go with that. Okay. So she says hi. So my response is from the player's perspective. So this is what I am saying to this character. So it's really important to keep perspective when you're writing these things, because that can get a little challenging. So just always remember that this is what the player is saying. So I could give her a nice, hey. Or let's see here. Okay, there we go. Or I'm going to blow her off. So I'm just not going to say anything. Okay, so we have the two choices, and now I'm going to take this link and I'm going to drag it to create a new node. So that connects the hey choice to this new dialog. So now if I double click on the node, it's nice to meet you. And I can click on the emotion. I'm going to make her happy. She's happy to meet us. And the node inherits the character and the background. So I don't have to make those again, select those again rather. Okay, so now I have a response for if we say hey. But now we need a response for if I decide to blow her off. And she's like, what the heck? Like, are you even listening? All right, so let's take a preview. Let's see how this looks. Hello, webinar attendees. So I can either say, hey, it's nice to meet you. She's happy. Or I can replay it. She's like, hello, webinar attendees. And I blow her off. And she's like, are you listening? What's going on? And so as you can see here, there's like an emotion meter. I did not include that in most of my scenarios because I want the learner to kind of infer that, but I did create a customer service scenario, and because the focus is on the character's emotions, I thought it was really important to make that very explicit to them. So that's when I included the emotion meter. So that's really all there is to it. It's not much more complicated than that. You can go in settings, you can turn off or on the emotion meter there. You can do voiceover, you can randomize choice order if you don't want people to memorize things. You can enable scoring. So if you want to make very explicit to your learners that there are optimal and suboptimal paths, that points meter works really well because then they can see they didn't get the top score and they can try other decisions. So, excuse me, now I'm going to show you a completed scenario. So let's take a look at that passport module you guys played. Here we go, edit. Okay, and let's zoom out and see the entire canvas. Okay, so this is what the entire canvas looks like. And what's really nice about Branch Track is that like someone comes over and they look over my shoulder and like it's on this and they're like, wow, that looks really complicated. It's not, it's really not. It just looks complicated, which is great. So like I can hover over a node and it shows all the connections. And so some design principles I use. So I really scaffold the learning at the beginning. So it's pretty linear at this point. And then they're allowed to make a decision, see what happens. I loop them back. And so what I do is I highlight fail states in red. So you can color the nodes whatever color you want. So if you have like the best path, a suboptimal path, and then a bad path, you could like use green nodes for the optimal path, orange nodes for the suboptimal path, and red nodes for the failure path. And so this is pretty much the trickiest thing I did. So I had to remember like which choice they selected because I wanted to decrease the menu options. You don't have to do that. That's just something I decided to do. And so I really like Branch Track. I think this is a great program. My last year in graduate school, I was really interested in visual novels and like visual novel engines. And this is the best one I've seen throughout my research because it's really easy and accessible to use. And it simplifies some of the things like getting art, getting different emotions for the same character. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's huge, having those assets. So I'm going to go back to PowerPoint now. So just hold tight for a second. Okay. So if you look at Branch Track and you're like, I don't know, it seems kind of expensive or something like that, you could always try Twine. So Twine works very similarly. So you see it's still this node-based structure. I type in text, but Twine is open source, first of all. Pros. It's open source, which means it's free. So you can use it at no cost to you. But trade-offs, like complex problems. There are no image assets, so you have to come up with those on your own. It's also syntactically based, which means that you have to learn how to type the right characters in order to create the links. Because in Branch Track, I was just able to drag those links. You cannot do that in Twine, at least as far as I'm aware. So there's some trade-offs, but if you're interested in this form of learning, Branch Track has like a 2-week demo, I believe. And then Twine is always free, so you can download it and check it out and see how it works for you. So these tools allow instructional designers to build simulations of complex scenarios that learners failed productively. They can test those hypotheses in a safe space where they're not going to lose clients or not injure patients, and they can see what happens, and they can use that data to reinform their hypotheses and problem solve in that space. So in doing so, learners discover how to problem solve. So we can go from having horribly boring education like this to having happy and engaged learners. So thank you for your time, and now is a great time to ask any questions you have, and I will do my best to address as many as I can. Just loading the screen here. Okay, so here's one here from Andy Higgin. People don't like failing assessments though. How do we create education where it's okay to learn by failing? So this kind of ties back to the model of education we have, in which we assess you and then pretty much like life decisions are based off of how well you did on that assessment. So it's really a reconceptualization of how education is supposed to work, because when we focus solely on education where we assess and try to learn by multiple choice questions, we don't really allow people to kind of explore that space. So our assessments are a reflection of our model of education, which is I transmit data to you and you either received it correctly or did not receive it correctly. So unfortunately, there is no easy solution to this because it requires an entire reconceptualization of the way education works. And so if we offer learning spaces where we don't have that assumption and we understand that people come with their experiences and they want to try things out in this space and possibly fail, that is a better way of educating and assessing. So thank you, Andy.
Hi, Jenny. This is John. So, if you had your crystal ball, would you? When do you think we're going to start seeing assessments more scenario based? I mean, how is this going to happen, and how can we encourage it?
I think it's definitely up and coming right now. There's a lot of interest in this approach to education, especially in the medical space, because when you're performing a surgery, there's a procedure, but there are sometimes unknown unknowns. Like sometimes they encounter things that they didn't anticipate because you can't always see things through scans. When you're working with people, you can't always predict how exactly they're going to act. People are very complex. So definitely like customer service jobs or things like that are definitely, I think, going to benefit from this sort of education. And we see people who really are starting to understand that putting text on a screen and expecting people to digest it is not an effective mode of education, and we're getting more requests.
Right. And what about the instructors? I mean, people are used to being, the sage on the stage. How do we persuade and encourage instructors to look towards game-based learning?
I think instructors just need to be educated in models of education, because we've had this theory in education that the transmittal of data is not how people learn since the 1800s. So just getting that information and distilling it to educators is going to be really important. Thank you, John. So I have one more question from Eleni, and the question is, what ensures that through this learning process in medicine, the learner will memorize clearly only the correct answer? It says intrinsic with an E, so I think that's intrinsic. is the intrinsic motivation also needed to confirm the right solution is eventually implemented? Yes. So, yeah, sometimes in life there is one correct answer. Like, this patient does have this diagnosis and not something else. Like, what you prescribe for diabetes is not what you prescribe for an infection. So this method of education is not saying that there are no right answers. What it's saying, though, is that sometimes there are complex ways and more information needed than simply memorizing one right answer. So learners will understand. So, for example, in the virtual patient demo, you can give the wrong diagnosis. And if you give the wrong diagnosis, it lets you know that like the patient is going to have problems if you misdiagnose him. So instead of like memorizing A, B, or C, I pick C, I get -5 points. I'm told that this patient is suffering because I misdiagnosed him. So that's a lot more emotionally resonant of an experience, and that's a lot more memorable. So yes, we can use this method of education in order to help people remember like what the right answer is. Okay, I think that's all we have. So if you have any more questions, feel free to contact me. So I've provided my email address, my Twitter, and my LinkedIn. Feel free to contact me at any of those channels. And I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for attending today. We have recorded this, so you'll be able to, you will receive an email with a link to this, this webinar. Please feel free to share it with others. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to tune in at our September and October and November webinars. It's the last Tuesday of the month at 11:30 Central. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And just one more note, there is a short survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. So if you would please give us your feedback, we would really appreciate it. And then just stay tuned for the email with further information on the fall webinar series and a link to this recording. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.